Welcome everyone to another episode of The Fire These Times, a podcast that I will one day learn how to introduce properly. But in the meantime, I have two guests with us today, previous guests of The Fire These Times, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a bit. We will be mostly focusing on the elections in France, sort of the background, context, what happened, the freak out in between the first round and the second round, the relief after the second round, but of course there's many questions being raised, and I'm sure the two guests will get into them. Of course, then the Olympics, which were the big international news, I suppose, for many folks, in some cases for all the wrong reasons. But also there's a lot of politics involved with the Olympics. I will say that I, myself and Aiden, my co-host, we did an episode with James Stout recently on the history of the Olympics. It was on the Paris Olympics, and we recorded it just before they were launched, and we launched it the day of the first day of the Olympics. But more like the history of the Olympics, the political side of it all, because it is a very, very political event and always has been. And yeah, so as I mentioned, it will be on France. This is a France specific episode. I know most of our listeners, well, all of them are Anglophones, and most will be like English speaking as their first language, and probably France isn't in their orbit. And so I hope this brings some clarity as to what the hell is going on, because there's quite a lot of moving pieces that are, even to me, as someone who lives like in France's neighbor, can be quite confusing. But yeah, let's start with some intros, if that's okay. Randomly, Reem, Sarah, if you want to go first, and then Sahar, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me again on the show. It's thank you so much for your work first, because I think it's absolutely necessary at the moment to bring facts, analysis, discussions in such a very informal and welcoming environment. I really appreciate it. So I'm Sarah Alouane. I'm a French legal scholar and a specialist in comparative law. And I mostly focus on human rights and freedoms, civil liberties, as well as constitutional law in France, Europe, and North America, especially Canada and the United States. And I focus a lot on religious freedom as well, and everything politics, so all the non-fun stuff. I used to be very active on Twitter. I'm not anymore, because I left this space because of what it had became, and I think it will be brought into the conversation. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here with Sahar.
Yes, so my name is Sahar Amarir. I work actually as a consultant on political and security developments in the Middle East and North Africa region, with a particular focus on North Africa. But I am a French-Moroccan dual citizen who, as I like to say, keeps a close eye on developments in France. And so, yeah, I've written a few articles about developments, particularly, affecting minorities in France. And yeah, thank you so much for having me again on the podcast, especially to, have a discussion with Reem Sarah on this. I think she's most certainly the most qualified person to have this discussion with, given how much of it, comes back in the end to legal issues, but also just, civil liberties. So, yeah, very happy to be here today.
Yeah, thank you both. As I mentioned, you're both repeated guests. I'll briefly mention the episodes you two did. Sahar, you were not too long ago here with Leila, was my co-host, Leila Shami, and we talked about anti-imperialism after the Syrian Revolution. Reem Sarah, this was in 2021, I believe. The episode is episode 72 for those listening, and it's called The Inherent Toxicity of France's quote-unquote Islamo-leftism obsession, which is still very relevant to this day, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
It mentioned, of course, things related to minorities. As it happens, as this is an Anglophone podcast, we were initially going to record this around the time of the French elections, but we postponed it for various reasons. And in the meantime, we had what's euphemistically called the race riots, or the rather racist riots in the UK. So maybe this problematic, let's say, is in some folks' minds, and so maybe I'll find ways maybe to link it in one way or another, but we'll see. I guess we can start with just some initial reflections on this past almost a month and a half ish, more or less, since the second round, which were not as bad in many ways compared to what I think many folks were very worried about for understandable reasons, at least in the sense of the far right did not get as much as it was expected, or at least as much as it was, to use Aurélien Mondon, a previous guest's terms, hyped in the media. There's a lot of this quote-unquote populist hype, which I had him on to talk about years ago, and then I had him on again about, I'm going to say, a month or so ago to talk about this concept, but specifically focusing on how the far right is not inevitable, as is often, that's how it's often described. And so I'll just reference that episode as we got into that more in depth. But yeah, some reflections on your part, and feel free to just kind of, take turns or intervene, whatever. We don't have to be super organized about this. It's fine.
You can go ahead, Sahar. I haven't heard you in such a long time, so so happy you're here.
I don't know how to really describe like the moment we're going through. It seems like everything is kind of like suspended in time. I feel like in a very Macronist way of things, the Olympic Games really provided for Macron this sort of like temporary salvation that, did work to a certain extent, right? Like to sort of like deviate people's minds from truly the, democratic crisis we're going through. Rimsara, might correct me on some legalities on this. There's much to say about it on the legal side.
Oh yeah.
Yes. I think this is really a classic case of sort of like the era we're living in, right? This era where the glitter of things, or like the grandiosity of large global events, sort of like managed to put a shadow on otherwise extremely worrying developments. Kind of this Hunger Games syndrome, right? And I think, unfortunately, it hasn't been a time that has been used, collectively in an efficient way to sort of like prepare for the, battle to come. I think generally this is going to be a battle for democracy. Perhaps when everyone rises again after the Olympic Games and then the summer break. And the discussions that we are gonna have as French people, as a collective, are, I think, truly at the crossroads of, history, really. I'm not even, dramatizing what I actually think. This is what I actually feel. And because you mentioned, those, quote unquote race riots, it's quite surprising to see Europeans, so reluctant to use the right word. If we check the definition, which is these are pogroms, this is effectively what's happening. And even among people who are still sort of like, mad at the situation domestically, like we're complaining, hey, we still don't have, a formal government. We still sort of like didn't talk things through. We're still, blocked. The situation in the UK hasn't sort of like, been included in the discourse, which I think actually is a great mistake. And should have been included as something that, is literally on the horizon for us. Perhaps in a different manner, but is. So yes, not sorry for the very pessimistic intro on my side on this. But this is my sentiment right now.
Yeah, I mean, you describe it extremely well. I don't know if you guys know that TV shows called The Bad Place. No, The Good Place, actually.
Yeah.
Well,
I do.
Yeah, lapsus. Well, I feel like I'm on a never-ending episode of The Good Place, except that I am in the bad place. It's like deja vu again and again and again and again, but it keeps getting worse with time. It's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. And I would say, actually, those elections, despite the results, are no good news at all, in the sense that, yes, the left won the majority and so on and so forth. But on a broader scale, it was a catastrophe. It was an absolute catastrophe. In many news outlets, whether in France, in Europe, I'm not sure about the Swana region, the Middle East, but also like in Anglo-American newspapers, calling Emmanuel Macron a genius. I mean, what kind of genius, unless they are evil geniuses, would randomly call for snap elections to put the country in danger? Because what happened, for the people who are not aware about it, is it went super fast, right? Snap elections. From the moment he dissolved the National Assembly to the results of the elections, minorities were in danger. People were attacked physically, sometimes, online, social media, like a whole, like everything was in the open. It was like freestyle attacks on minorities. For what? Just to have a Have Olympique. So we are going to halt everything because, yeah, Paris, the city of love, is holding the Olympic Games and, taking. So today, democracy is not only became a joke for the elite, but it's also slowly disappearing between our hands, under our nose, and nothing is done to stop this trend. And it's only going to get worse because, believe me, even with the results of the election, I don't believe for one moment that Macron is going to follow the results of this election. And so we're talking about a possible civil war and so on and so forth. Definitely people who never underwent civil wars. But the country is going to be extremely unstable for the year to come. And we can dig into that maybe later. It's going to be unstable and on purpose. So if that's a genius of Macron, I would say that it's the genius of a man who believes he is a king that has all powers, who behave like a king, but a spoiled one. Except that when you are the leader of a so-called democracy and the country of the Enlightenment, you don't play with democracy, you try to protect it. And that's clearly a failure on his side. So scary time, right?
I'm thinking, so I thought a bit about Brexit because obviously David Cameron at the time basically proposed the referendum on the UK staying or leaving the EU, leave or remain, to placate the more right-wing elements of his party, with clearly no expectation that it was going to pass. And he is not seen as a genius or whatnot right now. In many ways, he's was mostly forgotten until the last Tory made him foreign minister. And that's because the results didn't go well. So it's almost like the gambit, like he took a gamble and he lost that gamble. Now Macron took a gamble and he lost that gamble, but the people to his right also kind of lost to some extent that gamble. And so it's very easy for a lot of folks in the media, as we've been seeing, you've mentioned that coverage, to kind of ignore the more inconvenient elements of what's happening and basically say that, like, well, thanks to him, he has definitely proven that the far right is not popular, etc., etc. And it's very interesting to me how this usually happens. It is part of the populist hype because what I won't get, as I said, I won't get into it as much, although there is some relevance to this conversation, that in many ways, the discourse of the far right, to various extents, it's not like 100% that all the time, but to various extent is already the norm, is already kind of taken for granted, at the very least, as Mondon again talks about it, as like representing quote unquote the people. That there is this notion that who counts as a person, who counts as a as a French citizen, as a British citizen in the case of the UK, and again, context of those pogroms, those quote unquote, those racist riots. I mean, who counts as that, right? Like, there's always, we saw this in the context of Trump being elected as well, and the discourse around, or the left behind in Middle America, there's always an element of truth in a lot of that. In the UK, there is the North has been of the UK, of England, I mean, has been abandoned by post-industrialization and whatnot. What also, of course, is wrong is to think that this is only the racialized aspect of it. And in fact, when you do that, you erase the non-white working class, which in many cases tends to be, if not the majority, at least an integral part of the wider working class. So I'm saying this because those things there are parallels to at least the context that I'm more familiar with, which is the UK and the US. The worst kind of parallels, unfortunately, but they are there. And I guess now the both mentioned that, okay, you're being pessimistic. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you are. I don't know. I don't know what an optimism would look like right now. I do think there is it's a tension between those two. And I'm personally, I don't even use either. Things are bad. Things might get worse. It's even more likely that they get worse, based on what we know now. It doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done, of course. But what are your, what are your fears? What are your concerns over how things are being developed? And maybe provide some context for folks who are not, maybe haven't followed the detail. I think most folks know kind of the headlines of things, but not the details. On that.
Perhaps I'll start on that. I think it's really, important what you just said about, like, I have no idea what optimism would look like in a situation like this, right? Because what you were saying just a few minutes before is that we have normalized the far right discourse. This is the direct result of it. Yeah. We're absolutely unable to imagine a reality that is not entirely enmeshed within that discourse. Because we're in a situation, and this goes back to sort of like what was said earlier, you used, I think, a really important word, which is gamble. I think we've been used for decades, for better or for worse. This is not to say that it wasn't a system that was entirely, free of any justified criticism. But we were used to a sort of like more technocratic political class. And what we have now are gamblers. And in Macron's case, it's not even a gambler. It's a complete amateur. We're talking people who have no type of ground into, historical political culture, who have, high level references, but no true understanding of the depth of these historical moments that I think to a certain extent, I'm not a proponent to sort of like this theory, history is repeating itself, but, I forget who always used to say, history never repeats itself, but always rhymes. And the reason why it rhymes so much right now is precisely because of this amateurism. So it's hard to imagine a sort of like optimistic future, because, the current system has made sure we cannot. I think this is not sort of the beginning of something, but like in Rance's case, it's the continuity of at least a couple of decades of democratic regression. And, to sort of, again, go back to this idea of gambling, and perhaps on the, sort of like more detailed events that have like a concrete legal repercussions. Again, I'll leave that to Rimsara. But, this lack of sort of like grounding in our historical political culture is what allowed these leaders to gamble so much. And I think there's another aspect to it, which is that, and I think it's a huge problem in academia too, right? In this sort of like field of democratization and theories of authoritarianism, etc., where the scale to measure this is always taken on the global south and never on North countries, rich countries, which just has a certain explanation, implication that is also linked to the the sentiment of moral superiority that comes with it, which is that this will never happen to us, as if it didn't happen to us in the past, right? Like, because the scale for fascism was established based on northern criteria. And there's just a sense of we're just too good, that we will never fall into that. We're too clever. We're too morally and intellectually superior to fall ever again for these type of extreme politics, for the, this slippery, slope of fascism, etc. And I think this is sort of like an illusion that has, not just specific to France, but I think like general to a lot of Western countries. It has fed a lot into Western discourses. In France's case, I think there's something to be said about the extreme positive prejudice that we have on the international scene, which is that whatever French people do, it can never be wrong, right? It's always, and by the way, that's the danger of a positive prejudice, is that in the end it is a prejudice and it just completely distorts the reality, which is that, because so many sort of like leftist groundbreaking victories on the political scene were made in France or theorized here or exported from here, etc. That there's just, in people's minds, France is blocked like in the 50s, both like from the visuals that we have from France, what we imagine a French person to look like, to listen to eat, to read, etc. But this also touches upon the political side of things, which is that, oh no, this is the country of the French Revolution. It's a country of, free healthcare, etc. There can never be a downgrade from that. And I feel like, which is not to say there are actually, quite a lot of content in English that is written from, by people who are not French and who have really, really good analysis. But unfortunately, the bulk of them, it's not the case. The bulk of them, they come with this sort of like positive prejudice, and it's through this lens that they analyze France. I think Macron has benefited from that. I think some of the worst democratic regressions we've known in the past years were under Macron, and that it went completely under the radar on the international scene because there isn't this type of scrutiny. First, because France is a rich country, but also because France is France. So yeah, for me, there is something to be said about sort of like this international discourse of denial and extreme positivity when it comes to northern countries as well.
Yeah, I could easily add some stuff, but Sarah, please, first you.
Yeah, just to keep going and keep going, like in the aftermath of what Sahar was saying, and I would actually double down. I would say that not only, indeed, he's an amateur who basically President Macron. He's an amateur who basically ran the country as if he was running a business, except that he's a terrible businessman. But I would double down and say that actually he was knowing exactly what he was doing. Weirdly enough, maybe that's actually the paradox, in the sense that where Emmanuel Macron was not a popular president before those elections and before the EU elections as well. And I mean, you probably followed the news, like we have been going through strikes, many of them protests and so on and so forth. So he is not a popular president. His government is not exactly popular, which obviously doesn't help. But on top of that, what is the best way to keep power, but to create chaos and then pretend to basically be able to control it? And that's exactly what happened here. Divide and conquer, right? And one thing that people don't know, and I'm sorry if I'm going to sound super academic and super boring, so I will try to simplify it. It seems that also people are just discovering the joys of the Fifth Republic. We need to remind ourselves that this is exactly how our constitution is built for, to have a strong president because of history. Long story short, and again, just for context, I'm not getting into details, but after a lot of bad things that happened during the Third and the Fourth Republic and a very strong and parliamentarian instability because we had a parliamentarian regime, and then colonization of Algeria, decolonization, the War of Independence, one thing leading to another, Fifth Republic, 1958, where the General de Gaulle wanted to basically give a lot of power to the president of the Republic. So you have to understand that within our constitution, all mechanisms are made in a way so that the president is still in control. So even in the case of, let's say, a cohabitation, I don't like the translation of coexistence, but a cohabitation, like, for instance, having like a right-wing president and like, let's say, a left-wing prime minister, which has happened in France's history, right? The president is still in control in reality. For instance, let's say that Emmanuel Macron is bored and wants, another round of snap election. In July 2025, he can do that, right? Right now, he is in charge, of who is going to become prime minister. And there is this sort of, you remember the Spider-Man meme, like two Spider-Man looking at each other and that's exactly what's going on.
Yeah, pointing at each other.
Yes,
yeah.
That is France right now, except that you have two Macrons controlling the whole thing. And one should not be surprised that we are in a hyper-presidentialist regime where even the parliament, and especially the National Assembly, does not have as much power as we think. Let's go through all the legislation we passed in the last couple of years under Macron's both terms, right? Most of it comes from the executive. A lot of controversial reforms were passed by force, bypassing the parliamentarian process, right? It speaks volume when even the National Assembly doesn't have the last word, right? They are supposed to represent the people. My point being here is that I think it's time to rethink our institutions and the way we are giving too much power to the executive, because the executive is playing poker with it, and not good poker at all. And on top of that, what happened is the most vulnerable people are paying the high price. We were talking about vulnerable communities, whether it's racialized people or people with certain religion. I'm thinking of Muslims because they are the main target of government policies at the moment. The rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-LGBT plus hatred, etc., etc. But not only that, but also poor people. Poverty has increased in France. People are queuing to get a food package, for heaven's sake. In France, the country of human rights that we love to market across the world, the country of the Eiffel Tower, Dior and Chanel, where guess what? Actually, people are struggling. The dismantlement of our public services, because that's actually real France. The French national identity is actually our public service that we destroyed, that this administration and the previous ones, before Macron, to be honest, left and right, but Macron has accelerated this process of dismantling public services. Police brutality, the way we deal with disinformation, with fake news. And you were mentioning, and I come back to that, to the far right. Well, we are talking about normalization. I think it's absolutely the case. I completely 100% agree, but I think we are beyond that. It's not normalization anymore. The far right policies are into place. If you look at our immigration policies, for example, this is what the far right has always dreamed of. Actually, even our government is not hiding from it. I remember very recently, like 2-3 years ago, when Gérald Darmanin literally called for far-right voters to vote for them, as in Macron's party. So it's not even hidden anymore. The far-right is in power. Now the question is, when are they going to take power? And I think it will happen at some point, and they're getting closer and closer, despite the recent loss. But they are here, and Macron didn't do anything against it. Actually, he was playing with it, which I think it's my main fear, is like, we are playing with fire. We started to burn the garden, and now it's in the house.
If I can just...
Yeah, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something about the sort of rotten institutions and the need to change them. I think this is a super important point. People have been calling for sort of a new republic, the Sixth Republic, and that's most prevalent among the left wing for ages, really. But I think, to go back to this really important shift that happened, like in French politics, it's actually crazy to think about it. Obviously, like I 100% agree with, your sort of like a description of the Fifth Republic. This is a hyper presidential system. This is clearly, we killed the monarch, but we're nostalgic about having a monarch type of vibe. But, if you look at the history of this republic, there was an episode, for example, when, and, for context, for people who don't know, during World War II, full powers were given by the National Assembly to Pétain, who was the French leader during collaboration with Nazi Germany. And what happened during the Fifth Republic, when the quote unquote Algerian crisis started, is that something similar was done, right? Of like giving full powers to the Général de Gaulle to sort of like help France through the crisis. And we were talking literally just like a little bit more than a decade after World War II. The people were like, we'll need this sort of like providential like man to come and save us. And what sort of like saved, sort of like France, I'm putting quotes here. Obviously people can't see, but like from like falling into fascist sort of scenario was that General de Gaulle did what he wanted to do and then came back to normal after that, right? This happened because it was a sort of like idea of a democratic fiction, right? It's a fiction that everyone is like, there are certain boundaries, certain rules that we're not, willing to go over. These type of like unspoken rules with unspoken boundaries, unspoken practice of, constitutional sort of like customs happen only in a context where everyone is guided by fair play. This is not possible in a context where you have, first of all, amateurs, not technocrats, or people who are grounded in the historical political culture of the country. And certainly not with people who come with, very, again, like Macron, as Rimsara said, thinks he can lead France the way he can lead a business. And as she said, really rightfully, that's, he does it in a really bad way either way. And if you're a businessman and you're motivated by capitalist ideas, this is not the type of fair play ideas that are sort of like technocrat politician who is guided by democratic values would run by. Now, what I'm scared of is that this need to change to reform the Fifth Republic. We needed that yesterday, right? It's been ages that we should have changed that system because it is too prone to abuse. And we're more and more in a system where we're unable to put strong checks and balances on abuses. What I'm fearing is that we're sort of like, we were put in a situation where we need to change that system, but we are in front of such a dangerous moment that increased institutional instability is also a risk in and of itself. I'm not trying to say inertia is a good thing here or like just stagnation is good. What I'm saying is that, for whoever in our parliament is guided by values of democracy and strong institutions that support human rights and civil rights and equality for all, is going to be in a very impossible situation of having to change the situation and at the same time being in the least secure position to do that. And I think, there was a member of parliament from the Green Party, I think, that quoted a study that was that was done by the European Union on sort of like institutional instability across the union. And that sort of, again, I don't know about the methodology, but that sort of like calculated that if French institutions were to be severely attacked, it would take, I think, 16 months for them to completely crumble down. This is how fragile the French state is. So I think I think politicians and we citizens are also in front of an impossible choice because it has been made so by the political amateurism that preceded in the last couple of decades.
Thanks for that, like both of you. I'm sort of, I guess, reflecting on a lot of what we're talking. Okay, this is gonna be like a sweeping statement, obviously, because there's gonna be more nuance to that. But like, a lot of it seems to come from an inability to deal with certain quote unquote sensitive questions in a country like France, like the question of class, the question of race, and all of the interplay around them. Race, by which I mean racialization as well of Muslims, especially, but also, of course, other quote unquote minorities. One thing that is often, I think, misunderstood is that, okay, when there is coverage, when there is coverage of a, let's say again, the example of the UK quote unquote racist riots, the pogroms, etc. It's not so much who just condemns them. Like, you'll have politicians condemning them. That's more or less easy to do. It's what comes after. There's often like yes and, or there's but, right? Like I condemn this, but. And that's something that I've seen in France. I've seen it in the US is a different dynamic, but I have seen it there as well. And I've certainly seen it in like a lot of different contexts where especially this question of the people, quote unquote people, also cannot see me doing the quotations, the air marks, comes in. And the concern, again, as someone who's just like near France, but like France is very much like in our orbit, and I have lots of families in Marseille and Paris, and just something that is in the background a lot of the time in my life and other people's lives, obviously, as well, is that there does seem to be, again, to use this term again, normalization of the far right. We can say like it's already been normalized. It's not even like a process that is happening. It is already the case. And so it kind of feels that a lot of folks who are in power, the Macron and co of it all, are just more comfortable for whatever they think the situation is right now to be eternally extended for as long as is humanly possible. That there isn't actually a 10-year plan or whatever in that sense. It's like the plan is I want to stay in power and I need to stay in power, and that's kind of the beginning and end of it all. I'm sure there's more nuances to this, but that's kind of the impression I get often. And the concern here obviously is that a lot of the underlying problems that lead a society to have multiple strikes, to have everything from the Gilets jaunes to what comes after, to the debacle before the Olympics and the pause, let's say, that came with the Olympics, but that pause, and again in quotation, has, I don't know how to say that, has skeletons in its closet that at some point come out as well. The whole quote unquote social cleansing that had to be done to make Paris slightly prettier for the tourists and whatnot and stuff like that. That has consequences as well. And that has consequences that the people who are causing these crises in the first place, they have much more in common. They have a much greater interest in many ways in aligning themselves with the far right, obviously in this case, than with even like a slightly more moderate left wing. Like, I'm not even talking, too radical. Again, these are all quotations here. But like from their perspective of what's considered quote unquote normal, what's considered the center, it's already much more right wing in that sense. Like the Overton window has already been shifted to the right on multiple questions. And you have some others where, other issues, let's say, where it's sort of like an open-ended one. Like you don't actually know where they would land. So for example, if I talk about, how do they feel about the Macronists? How do they feel about Muslims and second generation immigrants, first generation immigrants, recent immigrants, etc.? It's an easy answer. They don't like them. It's pretty straightforward. It's not something that I think is too complicated to answer. They share in many ways the same kind of racist and Islamophobic views that the far right does, if only toned down occasionally. I still remember Macron telling Le Pen to her face that she is too soft on Islam. I remember that very well. So like occasionally toned down, not even a lot of the time, if not even most of the time maybe. Whereas on other questions, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's like being pro-LGBTQ rights, on women's rights, the right to abortion, that sort of things, they can play around with it a bit more. Sometimes I can feel, they oppose anti-Semitism because that's convenient for them right now, but maybe later on they don't, and they may have a how do you say, like a shade of tolerance towards certain types of anti-Semitism that are very French. And for those who don't know, I'm referring to the type of anti-Semitism we can see in France. You have the more obvious ones, quote unquote, the very obvious anti-Semitic slurs and conspiracy theories and all of that. But you also have the stuff that are more French in quotation, in the sense of like denying the role of France in World War II, saying like Vichy wasn't really France and France was actually in exile, etc., which we've seen on quote unquote the left and the far right, of course, as well. That kind of reactionary view of history, which to me, not to kind of bring it up all the time, but this kind of bit of the elephant in the room does have to do with the inability or unwillingness of both to deal with colonialism and to deal with that very obvious part of French history. We saw during the Olympics the Algerian team make a note, in a sense, too, because they were in the Seine. They were literally in the Seine as part of that procession on the first day. And for those who don't know, like, Algerians were literally drowned in the Seine. Ici on voit les Algériens was, the slogan. And here we drown Algerians. So, like, it's there. It's sort of like, again, it's like this elephant in the room that's not even too invisible. It's like just there, staring at you in the face. And yet it seems easier for a lot of them to just pursue this kind of privatizing absolutely everything as much as possible, treating everything like a business, even if they don't know how to run one, and just continuing to, it feels like a downward spiral with there's always an end. Like, nothing is permanent ever, but it's almost like they act as if it doesn't have an end. And that in and of itself is clearly dangerous, clearly destructive, because, to use that gambling metaphor again, they're dealing with forces that they themselves, at some point, when unleashed, they can't control anymore. They either join in, or they become themselves more far right, or they try and absorb part of it because they think this is how you stop the far right. And I'll stop on this because this is another common misconception in how to stop the far right. Unfortunately, I will maybe do some more specialized episode at some point on this specific topic. But the New Statesman, which is an Anglophone paper, had Nigel Farage on some weeks ago, not that long ago, and just allowed him to kind of be quoted and not even critically anything. And one of the quotes that they chose to go with, because I'm sure they knew this would be the most clickbaity thing to do, and that's another dimension of how toxic the media is now. Basically, him praising himself for stopping the far right and saying, like, no one has done a better job than me, and I'm paraphrasing here, at stopping the far right. Because what is defined as stopping the far right? That's the thing. I'll end on this. It's not the policy of the far right. It's not the politics of the far right. It's specific individuals who are most blatantly affiliated with the far right. So maybe I think at some point, the Rassemblement National, probably the smartest thing they did is just demote Marine Le Pen slightly. Just don't be the only face of it, just for now, because your dad is too infamous, let's say. And the far right in the UK is a bit like that. The Tories just absorb them a bit. You don't have the English Defence League in the same way as they were kind of officially dismantled. But their former leader, Tory Robinson, is still one that comes in and out and can dictate parts of policies. And of course, Nigel Farage being kind of the suit and tie version of that. And so stopping the far right is deliberately so, I think, often misunderstood, or at least downplayed, as not the policies. The policies, you have to take them seriously. You cannot be too mean to people who are too racist, or, openly say, it used to be better before the migrants came in, or whatever. You have to understand them. And I'm not saying don't understand them, but you have to also you have to understand them in a way that you accept part of their reasoning. You accept part of their logic. Because again, they are the people. They are the real quote unquote people. They are the ones when you talk about populism, you're not being a populist towards the black person or the Muslim or the brown person, etc., etc. You're being a populist, quote unquote, to that architect or archetypal figure, which is a white person, usually a white man. And so, yeah, I'll end on that. It's a lot of stuff. Hopefully it's not too much of a word salad, but it's something that is concerning, because it now feels like, I'm not saying that it's completely, like the system is completely abandoned in that sense, that there's no one behind the wheel. It's more like it feels like they're going faster and faster, like Macron and co are going faster and faster. And at some point they may just lose control of the car, to use that metaphor. Like, they're unleashing these forces that, again, they may think is not going to harm them, might even be good for them. History says otherwise most of the time. Even people who are quote unquote on the center right or whatever tend to be eaten up by the far right. But that they seem to genuinely still believe this, because that's what you get when you're an elite. You don't have to deal with reality until it's just too big. And even then, not all the time.
Listen, I think when it comes to the French case, this thing of sort of like dismantling the discourse is incredibly hard, because, for example, Islamophobia is a national consensus in France. It's a national consensus, including, among what people would consider to be like the, most progressist, left in France right now. Like, we have to remember the moments where, for example, Mélenchon was, sort of unsure how to respond to very clearly Islamophobic statements or incitements. And he's the head of what is considered to be the most radical leftist party in France, which again, because you mentioned this thing of sort of like spectrum, keep it in mind that what we consider the radical left today was a very mild center left, last century. And the spectrum has shifted because that discourse has poisoned literally everything in the political scene in France. It has poisoned the institutions. To briefly link that to what you were saying about the UK, one of the reasons why I was shocked by that, it's not that I was shocked that like pogroms against like migrants or Muslims occurred in Europe. I was shocked it occurred like in the UK, not in France, because there's no Western country that has such an advanced entrenchment of Islamophobia in its institutions and legal system as France. And if I'm wrong, then Sahar can correct me.
I think.
But
if I can't really, I think. Sorry. I think that was in many ways it happened. Let's say first in the UK, almost by happenstance. Mm-hmm. There was that killing of the 3 girls. Then that was followed the 3 kids. That was then followed by a lot of disinformation online, which was also propped up by Elon Musk and folks like that. And it was kind of the perfect storm. It was in English, which is a big thing, big difference as well, that the Americans don't pay as much attention to French politics for that reason. Probably good for France, by the way. But I think it's more like happenstance in many ways. It came at the right time, right after Labour won, right after all of this, that it almost was the perfect storm for that type of thing to happen.
Yeah, anyway, the circumstances for that were laid before, right? I think that something that comes back a lot, for example, is that we make a lot of comparisons with the 30s, with the 1930s, just to be clear. I think the reason why it's wrong is that the most correct, perhaps comparative point is with the 20th and the decades preceding that. The type of discourses that were laid in towards the population, the insinuations, the sort of things that were implied, and that made it so easy for everyone, for example, at some point to link every single one of their grievances to the Jews, right? So it takes decades to build that up. And then the opportunity pops up for the fascists to, do pogroms or pass a law and strip a whole community of their rights. But the foundations of that were laid prior to that. And I think our societies are extremely like badly equipped to respond to that. In France's case, again, because of like how sort of like prevalent that discourse is. I was also sort of like, again, shocked by how little that sort of like shook people of color, like in continental Europe. I feel like this is an extremely important moment in the sense that whatever the British community decides to do in the UK is actually going to be determinant for, Muslims in continental Europe as well. And to go back to, this thing of, sort of like how the far right played this out, changing the figures, etc. I think the far right has played its cards extremely well in the past decades. I mean, for people who have been sort of like following these movements, it was like in the early up to like mid 2000s that the far right already started connecting like more efficiently, like through different countries, inviting each other to their balls, etc. Or, for the aristocratic part of it, of course. And they're actually extremely well connected and well coordinated in a sense that like the sort of like anti-fascist groups or like people who are sympathetic to the anti-fascist movement are absolutely not. And one thing you mentioned, and I'll stop after that because I want to let Sahar talk. But like when you said it was sort of like circumstantial and the Labour won, etc. One fear that I have in France is that if you look at sort of the level of Islamophobia in the political discourse and the daily discourse over the past 2 decades, it's absolutely, it is stratospheric. Like, it is out of this world. Now, institutionally, this has had like concrete implications. There were a lot of laws that were passed. There were a lot of laws that infringed on civil rights and individual liberties. But and like Islamophobic acts were also really high. But for me, compared to the discourse, there is a discrepancy, right? The discourse is way stronger, and the number of Islamophobic are like sort of like lower than what such a discourse could lead to. And my sort of like intrusive thoughts about this, if I can say, because it does not have like a scientific, like sort of like grounded now. I hope it never does, to be frank. But my fear is that the reason why there weren't more violent acts, or like in a bigger number or in a larger scale, is because to a certain extent, the fascist and racist elements in France were vindicated in their hate, in the sense that the state was subcontracting their hate for them. The state was institutionalizing it for them, right? So you don't feel the need to take up, matters into your own hands if the state half does it for you, even if it doesn't fully do it for you, right? The extreme far right in this country is absolutely not happy for Macron. For them, he's like a immigrant lover, etc. They live in their own fiction, but he's implemented enough laws and done enough things and said enough things that he's not a fully declared enemy the way the left wing is. And me, one of my fears when the left won, and which, again, to come back to this, impossibility to imagine a better reality, is that I wanted the left to win, but I knew that if they won, we would be in trouble, right? They created a sort of like impossible reality for us. I was extremely fearful of the fact that should the left win in France, then those more radical elements in France would start to take things into their own hands more violently. And to come back to this UK example, because you did mention, it was sort of like circumstantial, etc. I think it was not a coincidence that this happened in the UK after the Labour won. And we're not talking like left, etc. But that's enough left for the fascist people to be triggered. And to be frankly honest, France and UK are the two countries where like the immigrants are sort of like, I would say, most well integrated into the social fabric. So it's logical that is where the rejection would be sort of like the most visceral. But it's a fear of mine, and that I think in France could lead to something even more dangerous because of how institutions are so enmeshed with, state Islamophobia.
Mm-hmm. There is, I should say, like maybe to complement what you said, that if one comparison between the UK and France, to the extent that this is useful at all, it doesn't necessarily have to, is that I do think in many ways, as you said, there is more of a state-centric politics in France than there is in the UK. It has to do with just the UK being a weird combination of different systems and technically 4 different nations and stuff like that, and the monarchy kind of confusing it all. But in France, in the sense that it is more centralized in that sense, and there is more of a, I think, I could be wrong, but my impression is that there is more of a conformity to certain types of politics than you do in the UK. Not that you don't have in the UK, you do, but a bit more. It's more like in the UK, it's not like shocking to have a mayor of London who's Muslim. You see what like there are certain flexibilities that, again, without downplaying the risks that still come with what we mentioned, obviously, coming out of those riots. But there's a bit more flexibility. Like the First Minister of Scotland also was a Muslim and stuff like that. That it pisses a lot of people off, but it doesn't necessarily get that much traction immediately. As I think, like, I can't even. It's inconceivable for me to imagine the mayor of Paris being, openly Muslim and stuff like that. I can't quite picture. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I have difficulties with that picture because of what I know France to be in that sense. So that maybe that says more about me. I don't know, but yeah.
It's inconceivable for us too, to be honest, at least for me, but
Yeah.
Just to keep going, like a couple of thoughts, not necessarily in the right order, if I may. First of all, I forgot to mention it previously, but we don't have good check and balance in France. Actually, we barely have any. Like, the Constitutional Council is not a Supreme Court, right? So they won't be able, in case of a crisis, to actually do something. Same with the justice. Like, the justice system is constantly being attacked, being underfunded, etc. So there is this issue as well of check and balance. We don't have any in France. So if something happens, we literally are screwed. And I don't say that to be like, a drama queen or whatever. But this is an issue that, weirdly enough, if I want to compare to the US with all the problems they have, including with the Supreme Court, they still actually have some check and balance. It's problematic on many issues. Don't get me wrong. The Supreme Court is completely ruined, but there are check and balances, right? It's not the case in France on purpose. So we should fear about that. And second, like I said, no organization here. It's just randomly conversational. One of Macron's biggest failure, and probably he pushed for that, he destroyed the center. He did what Sarkozy did before him. He did what François Hollande did before him. He basically made sure that his party, that he doesn't even like seriously, he does not even defend the interest of his own party in general. Because I don't think his party is actually sustainable in the long term. I think it would disappear.
I mean, it says a lot that we call them Macronisme.
Yeah, Macronisme. It's trend.
We're barely bothering with the actual.
Exactly. I cannot even keep track with the renaming of the party itself. I think we stop at Renaissance at this point, or whatever. Anyway. But the point being, he destroyed the center by turning into the right/far right, narrative. Except that people always like the original version. So anything Macron does, people will be more attracted to the far right, right? Because they are you want to buy the original version, not the pale copy. And it's working. So he killed the center, which was supposed to find some sort of equilibrium between both sides of the political spectrum. Then a third thought I have, and maybe that can be an idea for podcast, like an episode of your podcast. We have a problem with the left. And you started to really well to talk about it, Sahar, and I follow you on that. But the left, and especially the Socialist Party, but not only, there are also a lot of issues with Mélenchon's party, whether it's international policies, but also the kind of hidden anti-Muslim racism that is kind of covered sometimes by, we love everybody and cute leftism. But actually, there was a case of Mélenchon, regarding the wearing of a headscarf of a woman. And he made some very problematic comments. Same when Algeria released a banknote written in English to celebrate. I can't even remember what was celebrated at the time. Mélenchon made a comment on how France is losing its influence across. And I'm like, well, it's an independent country. They want to use whatever language they want. They kind of do what they want, right? So just to tell you, basically, we do have a problem with the left. And as long as we don't fix the left, I don't think there are any way we can get out of this mess, for one simple reason. The left is politely and racist. They intellectualize the racism. So it's more attracted to this sphere of the elite, the quote unquote, I'm doing the quote unquote mark sign too, even if nobody can see it. But we intellectualize anti-Muslim racism. We we want to free women, right? Because it's in our culture. Well, when you look at the way we treat domestic violence in this country, I don't think we are saving women. But hey, we go after the people who are the most vulnerable of this country. The philosophers. We give a lot of we give platforms to the media / superstar philosophers, because it's a job in France, who just can influence policy because they're intellectuals. And we love that in that country, except that these people have direct ties to the left, and the left had become basically, yes, a polite right-wing party who will use minorities as tokens, and it's minorities who fit into their ideas of what being a good French is. And the moment you deviate from their narrative, you out. You're considered like a threat to the nation. So it's no different than what the right wing or even the far left are doing. And as long as we don't address that, I don't think we have any exit. And last thought, France has a lot of dirty laundry that for many years, and I would say until social media became a thing, I guess, and media became a bit more, for better or worse, but like more media came into investigating, studying those issues, we managed to keep this dirty laundry at home, right? I'm thinking about colonialism. I'm thinking about our super dark past with World War II, with anti-Semitism, etc. Anti-women as well, because until very recently, and we are still not treating women's rights in a good. I mean, we don't have good women.
For those,
it's.
I had to interject very quickly, Reem. Sorry. But like, France even had like a pretty vocal anti-Me Too politics led by cis women, all white, of course, but
it was the only.
It is a thing.
It was
the only country where you had an official, like, how do you say tribune in English? Like, you had people like sign a petition, like a petition in support of men in the artistic scene, like that's unimaginable even in the US. Like, people would find like more sort of like, would play a sort of like intellectual gymnastic to find a way to defend like Weinstein or so, anyway, they'll make any sort of like hypocritical statement, but they would still be too ashamed to do something like this. And France, to my knowledge, is the only country that was like so shameless, and it was signed by hundreds of artists. And I'm not talking like
from the left, right?
Like, but like artists that claim to be from the left, but also A-listed artists in this country. It was absolutely insane, and also something that the US media completely missed.
Oh no, totally, and that's what I mean. Like the Me Too movement, and actually the French Me Too, like the woman who led the French Me Too, she was condemned. That's actually the whole, So and again, domestic violence, huge issue here. Like we don't. Anyway, point being, this dirty laundry is now out, and France cannot control it anymore. And I think that's also. I might be wrong, right? But that's also one of the reasons they double down to keep, to do damage control somehow. So every time, and also the fact that there is a democratization of access to university, academia, even if it's not perfect, but it has changed in like 50, 60 years. We do have now minorities who become experts, whether it's in academia or outside of academia, like journalists and so on and so forth, who basically start talking from the point of view of the people, whether it's racialized minorities or LGBT or like women or people, under the poverty line, who talk about those things, discrimination, etc. And for the establishment, whether it's on the right or the left, it seems it's perceived as a threat for their power to be like taken off. And we talk about that when we discuss Islamoleftism, but that's exactly it. It's the elite keeping the monopoly of.
We should say, Reem, this was in quotation, Islamoleft.
Oh no, Islamoleft, quote unquote. But everything is connected. And finally, when it comes to the far right, the far right are amateurs politicians. Like literally, you interview someone from Le Pen's party. I mean, Bardela's party now, but it's really Marine Le Pen. When you start to dig into details, like they cannot answer any question, whether it's the budget, whether it's healthcare, whatever. They suck. They're amateurs, but we are doing the job for them. We are giving all the element on a silver platter for them to use. And knowing that nowadays the far right is a transnational movement on an international level, they're gathering force, whether it's on social media. I mean, Elon Musk, come on, like social media, the dark web, all of these organizations, especially certain think tanks in the West, but not only in the West, in other countries as well, gather forces under the guise of studies, again, to basically reinforce the power of the far right and to make them more visible, even more normalized. And we need to brace ourselves for the worst because it's a transnational movement. And we all know how transnational movements, when it comes to the far right or these type of folks, and again, we have a dark past in this country. And if we do not address the problem at its roots, I honestly, I'm so sorry to be pessimistic, but it's going to be tough. But I guess it has to get worse before it gets better. But if we can avoid repeating, I mean, keep going with the same mistake, I should say, it's going to be hard. But for that, you have indeed, you both mentioned that really well. Random people need also to realize that because now it's so normal and it's so vocal now. I'm old enough to remember how being from the far right was a taboo. You would not invite Le Pen on television. Now, and as a personal experience, right before the second round of right before, I think, I have a friend of mine, friend, quote unquote, again, acquaintance, who literally said to my face, "Oh, I really hate Muslims. They are so problematic to that country, and I think we need to do something about them, especially veiled Muslim women. They are potential terrorists. You know what? You know that." And she said that to my face, normally, and I look at her. I'm like, "Are you being serious?" And again, she's a very nice person, by the way. Like, it's not even. And she's like, "Yes," but I'm like, "Are you really talking to me?" And she's like, "But you're so different. Like, you're not like them." And I'm like, "What do you mean by them?" And that's how I realized. I mean, I already realized that, but it has touched like the general population, and what used to be a diversion to keep people diverted from the real issues of that country, who indeed are like, our public services being dismantled, poverty, people who are supposed to pay the taxes and don't pay them, but like the poorest, like we cannot survive in that country. Really, everything is becoming so expensive. The inflation, security, etc., has become the norm, and it's normal now to say that to someone's face without thinking of the consequences of their words. That's how I think, like, we let the monster is becoming a beast that we cannot control anymore.
So I'm going to do something that's a bit difficult given this conversation. And first I'll some fairly brief reflections on my part. Then I'm gonna try and see if we can find some optimism.
Oh, tough luck.
In the sense that I generally, the binaries of optimism and pessimism is something I reflect on a lot, but it's not important for this conversation. So general reflections for me, I do think we're at at the point right now where it's kind of how do you say this? I'm gonna use probably just bad expression here, but kind of a hit and miss situation. Not in the sense that I expect the quote unquote left to come to our help or to come and save us or anything like that, but because I'm seeing there are different moving pieces that affect. Let's stick to France because not to make it too broad of a comment here, that can affect how, let's say, the far right organizes. That's it. Like, it's one of my particular obsessions. What's happening with the far right, and one of the potentially good news, and I have to emphasize on potentially, because it can go in different directions and it may not happen whatsoever, and it can and may even more likely, I don't know, get worse, is that there's also, it's transnational, but there's so much internal divisions. to the point that they in many cases, the recent split between the AfD and Le Pen, the complicated relationships they have with Putin. Do we love him? Do we not love him? Stuff like that. Or how open do we love him versus how not, stuff like that. And of course, the center of it all at the time, at least, the thing that accelerated this trend. It did not cause it. I'm not saying it started with Trump or anything. Of course not. But it accelerated. It made it much easier, much faster. It was kind of they were an excitement almost on the far right, of course, when he won, and then Brexit was in the span of about 6 months. But they might be in the twilight zone. We don't know. There's a lot of internal divisions within them as well. There's a lot of, for better or worse, Labour not being the Tories is facilitating certain other types of politics, worsening some, don't get me wrong. Labour is very anti-immigration, for one, actually, in many ways. This is an anecdote, but I have a friend whose brother is a lawyer, an immigration lawyer in the UK, and he said his concern is that Labour will be efficient, because the Tories were very inefficient and they defunded the police in many ways and defunded the border forces in many other ways and stuff like that, to certain extents in different ways. They wanted to privatize it, essentially, which made it more inefficient because privatization tends to do that. And Labour, one of their platforms, one of their 4 or 5 points that they got elected for, to be honest, they mostly got elected for not being the Tories. But the thing that they said that they would do is make the border police more efficient. And that can mean worse life for migrants, effectively, including asylum seekers and most vulnerable among them, of course. So there is that could happen. But on the far right specifically, and here I'm defining the far right in the UK, for example, as Nigel Farage and plus to the right, and maybe Tories and to the right of the Tories, they are much more lost than they've ever been. And that's good news. I want them lost. I don't want them full of confidence. I don't want them to know what they're doing. I want them to always be on the run, or to ask themselves questions. Who actually is our allies? Like Nigel Farage versus Tommy Robinson. Do they like each other? No. Is it good? No, etc., etc. And in France, whether it's French politics within France or French politics within the EU, because they intersect, there are some indications that they could also have so many long-term problems within themselves and with other parties. Because the good news, again, potentially, is that the far right needed to be transnational compared to be in, let's say, before, where they were kind of by default transnational, but it wasn't their focus. They were like hyper-nationalists, of course, German, Italian, Japanese, etc. And they found ways to work with one another because it was convenient, more than anything. Now they need to work with one another because they need each other. Because in many ways, we already live in a transnational world, and they have to adapt to that. And for the most part, they're not always very good at it. Hence the splits, because they have this tension, they have this contradiction. They are hyper-nationalists, but before being hyper-nationalist in France means hating the Germans. Now they can't do that in the same way. They have to hate the internal enemy, in many ways a replication of anti-Semitism of the past, and in many ways ongoing to this day. And that is, the Arab, the Muslim, the black person, the et cetera, et cetera. And also the Jew. That's something that it often it follows up from that form of politics. So in no way am I saying it's going to be good. And in no ways am I saying, it has to be worse in order to get better. I don't know. I have no idea. But there are cracks, and that's what I'm interested in. And so a bit of a challenging question, do your best, is assuming we agree that there are cracks, and cracks don't mean that things are good, but there are cracks. They're not perfect. They're not flawed and flawless. They don't have unlimited power, at least not yet. What are certain maneuvers you think, or certain actions that people in France and outside of France, and whether they're connected to France or, what are anti-fascist, etc., what are certain things that can be done, essentially, in your opinion, to, if not immediately defeat them, because that's probably too grandiose of a mission, but really weaken them in a way that, and by them, last qualification, and then I'll shut up. But by them, I don't just mean the individuals like Zemmour and Le Pen, not just them too, that would be nice, but the logic that underpins them. How do we stop and reverse and oppose the normalization of the far right? Let me put it that way. And good luck, because that's an easy question.
Perhaps I'll ask you, which
first.
one would you prefer to go first? Because this happens very rarely for me to be in such strong disagreement with you. but it's the case right now.
Perfect.
So,
Perfect.
I don't know.
No, please go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it. Yeah, go, Sahar,
So
go, please.
I disagree so much on this thing of cracks. And I will tell you why. First of all, those disagreements are not on fundamental issues. They're not on fundamental issues. The links to Russia are not the fundamental issue across the far right in Europe. It's one issue in foreign policy, but it doesn't touch to the pillars, right? When we're talking about civil liberties and laws and I don't like this word either, but like coexistence, but like just like having a strong social fabric, we're talking about the fundamentals of a society. And on this, the far rights all across Europe are aligned. And the disagreements on fundamental issues are way greater among the left than they are among the far right. Just look, okay, right now, this whole session is about France. The left won by what? A margin. And they had to gather every single group in the entire leftist and in the entire spectrum that is not right wing. And they barely made it through. And the disagreements are so profound that it's the reason why everyone was surprised when the left won, even if it was marginally, because it seemed like an impossible feat. So me, I have a profound disagreement with you on that. It's that I think these are not real cracks. They're not profound enough. It is enough for the far right to have a strong anti-immigration project, a strong racist project, a strong ethnic cleansing project. We can talk about ethnic cleansing. We had Zemmour in France was openly calling for ethnic cleansing. You have groups in Europe who are openly calling for that. I think also we should not be scared of using the right words for this, just like we should not be scared of telling what's happening in the UK pogroms and not race riots. The only way out of that, and this is not what is happening right now, it would be a complete overhaul of the left, which, by the way, I have to say that in France, there were like feuds with members of the radical left who were pandering to the far right. Like, this is how bad the discourse has gotten. So we would need a complete overhaul and truly a miracle where like the left would wake up and realize that, as Rim Sarah said so rightfully, you cannot beat the OJ. So you will never be better than the far right on the far right. You will never be better than the populists in populism. And they would need to realize that and all act on it and all do like a complete 188-degree on civil rights and civil liberty and on democratic principles, which is honestly what I'm scared about because, you know, you have this whole theory, like in sort of like, you know, theories of democratization and democracy in general, that when you have a side that starts playing hardball, then the other side can decide to play hardball against them or to continue to play fair play, but they would risk losing more and more as the more they play fair play, right? And so there's just this shift that they would end up playing dirty too, just to keep up with the other, even if it's not by intent. And to be honest, whether it's in the right wing or the left wing in France, there are a lot of people who are extremely disengaged towards democratic principles and extremely disengaged in the defense of, whatever remains democratic in our institutions. And I think that's the greater danger of it all, right? It's like in the end, both were not protecting the system, and then people are playing dirty against that system. So yeah, for me, there are no real cracks among the far right. And they can continue to play like at a very low intellectual level. Their hate of us is enough to unite them. And the lack of ability of the left to actually suggest a real political project that is really, that can really be implemented, that appeal to the masses, and that is strongly entrenched in human rights and progressive values, is gonna remain a weakness that the far right will be able to play to their advantage. So we would need a complete overhaul.
No, thanks for that, Sahar. Reem?
It's such a hard question. I can go on and say we need to promote comprehensive civic education and, fight misinformation, which we need to do, right? But that would be really cute proposals, and that won't change a thing, to be honest. Uh, Two things. The role of the EU. I think the EU has to move sky and earth to actually tackle this. I think at this point, the solution should be on the supranational level. Because we have to abide by certain obligations that we are blatantly violating, okay? But we are friends, so we can. And I know very well the problem. Again, we can argue that yes, the EU are very technocrats. They are. It's the elite. It is. But at the same time, it's still a different level. And again, we have to abide by certain obligations, which we are not at the current moment. And I think the EU has to be brave enough. I don't know if they are right now. I'm not sure they are, to put an end to this and to actually act upon it. And I do know some people within the EU are trying hard, but it's like David and Goliath, right? It's a very tough battle when all of this horrific discourses, narratives, policies, parties, people have literally infiltrated the system. But still, the EU, I think, is in a position of doing something, but there is no will right now. And I think we need to push for the EU to have that will, because when there is a will, there is a way. It will take decades. Don't get me wrong. It's not happening tomorrow. I'm not being like super optimistic, but I think there is a path out if the EU actually did something. Second, on a more domestic level, the role of civil servants and judges. Because in the end, policies are made on a local level. And I think we need to act more locally before thinking national. Because in the end, it's so funny because local elections are a total different beast, because you vote, for actually problems that affect you directly. And regardless what political border you are, you see through people's BS, right? If I may say that like this. And usually not every time, of course, because there are a lot of exceptions, but you usually vote for the interest of the community, your city, your town, whatever. And I think that acting locally would be a start to actually fight the battle from the bottom to the top and not the other way around. Again, it's a long run. I think civil servants also have a role to play because they are the one implementing, policies, but they are also the one who knows the reality of the field, like on the ground. And again, not perfect because there are a lot of issues, right? And judges, will the justice system will actually do their work? Some are trying really hard, and we are trying to, to prevent them from doing the jobs. But I still want to believe in some sort of justice. And I think judges have a huge role to play when the issues end in their, in their hands. But again, it's in the long run. But yes, the role of the EU and acting locally before acting nationally.
I think, Sahar, can I ask a question? I'm sorry, it's going to be a short one, I promise. But I can't have be a contrarian on this.
Oh no, you have to. And again, I'm not sure I even believe in it, but
that's how impossible it is for me to imagine any type of optimism in the French context. So I apologize for those who will listen to this. You mentioned the EU. I think it's really interesting, just maybe because I like the idea of the far right trying to use Europe against us and then us pulling sort of like a reverse Uno on them on that, right? There were civil rights groups in France that tried to appeal to European courts to overrule French legislation, and I'm thinking, specifically about the laws about hijab, right? My understanding is that European courts have always evaded the question and said this is something to be dealt with on a national level, or in some certain minor cases, I don't know if it was specifically about the hijab, but other civil rights issues, sort of like stood by the countries, right? What would it take for the EU to shift from this sort of like coward position that they're having right now because they don't want to stand against one of the more powerful members on this, especially on an issue that is so sensitive, given the predominance of the far-right discourse on the entire continent. What would it take for them to shift on that?
Well, when I was talking first about the EU, I was talking about the institutions, not the courts. So the courts are another matter. And you are right. And the problem is the courts have been so politicized that they have been not willing to actually, do something about it, whether it's the European Court of Human Rights, so that's not the EU, that's the Council of Europe, or Luxembourg, right, the CGEU, which have missed an opportunity to make a stance. But again, you have to dig a little bit into the dissenting opinions that were given, where you did have some judges saying you are making a mistake, right? And regarding the European Court of Human Rights, and I will be super brief, they have been so disappointed on the issue. They have not been doing their work when it comes to religious freedom in a very long time. So it's a mess here. But there are recent court decisions on different matters, and it was about Bosnia, I think, and the wearing of religious signs in court, where there is a sign of. But again, it was the context as well, etc. But the courts indeed have failed so far, and I think it's a big shame. But when I was talking about the EU, I was mostly talking about the institutional level, and I was thinking about lobbyists as well. Because let's face it, if you're not a good lobbyist, the EU won't actually listen to you. And I think for that, and that would be my conclusion, it has to come from the bottom, Sahar. Again, I might be wrong, but you also have activist groups who need to get their things together and actually be efficient instead of also fighting each other, right? Because we all know there are some issues in between different human rights organizations or Muslims' rights organization or whatever rights organization. And I think that they also need to be more efficient to address it, because I know very well there are people within the EU who are trying, but who do not have the capacity to do it. And again, you are facing a political institution, not a legal one. I mean, there is a legal part of it, but it's political, most of it. And I think it has to come from the bottom. Otherwise, clearly, they will not follow. And I'm telling you, it won't happen before maybe 20 years. That's how bad it is, right? But I know very well that there is some will. But the problem is we still fear to address that because anti-Muslim racism is so entrenched, and just racism in general, that we are still not able to even call it by what it is, profound racism. For me, it's even more than a phobia at this time. I mean, your phobia against bugs, right? Oh my God, the bug, I'm scared. I have a phobia. This is beyond phobia to me. This is pure hatred. This is racism. And, but again, that's why I was talking to organize on the bottom of the scale, because if you go directly, please change the law, of course they won't. And they're not willing to right now, but I know there are some people who are. But the question is how, really? And again, political will and influence and lobbyists. But I don't disagree with you at all, by the way. Just trying to be a bit optimistic.
Yeah,
sorry, we talk too much.
No, please. It's the reality of a podcast. We have to wrap it up now, but I will say quickly a couple of things. One, it's a very to be continued conversation, I feel. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Two, I actually appreciate the rebuttal, Sahar, because while you were talking, I realized that probably it's better to say, rather than there are cracks, that, there might be some and there could be more. This is like a happy added nuance, if you want, because maybe in the almost by default in how I want to approach the far right, I'm always looking for cracks, essentially.
I am too. It's just I can't find them, but I am.
I honestly appreciate that. So no worries at all about that. Where can people follow you? We'll put everything in the show notes regardless. If you want to plug anything, please feel free. It could be like an article you've written or something you've read, or follow you online or whatever it might be. Please go for it, Rimsar and then Sahar, and we'll leave it at that for now.
Awesome. It was such a pleasure to talk to you both, really. Thank you so much. It was amazing. So I left Twitter for obvious reasons. That thing is so problematic. So mostly on LinkedIn, definitely. And I started to post also on Blue Sky. So you can find me there, rimsara.com. I'm still not very active there, but I'm starting to come back on social media, I guess, but mostly on LinkedIn. My full name, Rimsara Alouane.
Cool. I'll link that in the show notes. And Sahar?
Awesome.
Yes, thank you so much for this talk. And definitely, I think, France is one of those never-ending subjects where you will never run out of ideas for podcast episodes. Regarding where you can follow me, to be completely honest, I'm intermittently on Twitter. I post a lot of memes and jokes, so not always serious as well. But because we're on the subject of France, and I'm conscious that the people who are listening to us are perhaps, not necessarily French speakers, I might get his name wrong, but I will definitely get his account right when I send it to you. There's a journalist based in France, who I believe, I don't want to get the newspaper wrong actually, but I believe his name is Cole Strenger, who does a very, very good, coverage of France with very strong analysis, that I feel like has a really good grasp of the nuances that are happening on the ground. By the way, I do not know this guy. It's just that he writes good stuff. So I'm not sort of plugging a friend of mine here. But I would suggest people, because I think scrutiny on France is one thing that would help actually progressist movements in France. Because every time France gets out of its denial and accepts to have a discussion about, these subjects it's avoiding, as you said, it is after, a sort of international or foreign scrutiny on it. So get informed on France, but get informed deeply on those issues, not these sort of superficial analysis that a lot of people do. Follow this guy and try to support progressive French groups.
Thanks, Sahar. Do send me that link or include it in the show note. And all that's left for me is to thank you both for this. It's impossible we said we'll stay to 15 minutes, but that was unrealistic. It is what it is. The conversation will go on, and I hope folks listening to this got it out of it. I know I did. And thanks again, both of you. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Merci.
This has been another episode of the Fire These Times. If you like this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. And if you really like this podcast, head on to patreon.com/firethesetimes. That's patreon.com/firethesetimes. The Fire These Times is a media ecosystem based in the Periphery that supports a bunch of media projects, including this one. For $5 a month, and even less if you opt for the yearly subscription, you can help this ecosystem grow and get early access to all episodes of the Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, Obscuristan, and Ghida, as well as an invitation to join our monthly hangout, watch parties, upcoming book club, as well as exclusive episodes. Thank you for listening, and take care everyone.